or land use appropriation, and to some, a general sense of disdain, not only for safe access, but for largely ignoring the revenue generated by the industry for badly needed health services and basically not compliant with state law. What do you think is the problem statewide, and how do you handle it here in West Hollywood?
We made a lot of progress. You know, when I think back to where we were in the early days of the epidemic and where we are today, it was pretty radical back then. There was an organization that I was part of called the Life AIDS Lobby, which drafted all of the legislation that would go on to become the body of law that dealt with the epidemic here in California. We had some legislation there to create pilot programs to attempt to do needle exchanges in counties like Contra Costa County, San Francisco County, Los Angeles County. We kept facing gubernatorial vetoes. Well, today, that is the standard and the norm. We do have needle exchange programs in most of the urban centers around the state. And although it's still in the gray area in terms of what's lawful and not, law enforcement has learned to sort of work with us. Proposition 215 didn't come out of a vacuum. Proposition 215, medical marijuana in California, came out of the AIDS movement.
Correct.
It was something that we created with Dennis Perone, with Reverend Scott Imler. I mean, it was our response to the epidemic that pushed Proposition 215 to the ballot and passed it. So we've made incredible movement there.
Right, but some say that the marijuana industry has not entirely stuck with a medical face, oftentimes advertising with money and guns and whatnot, and quite notably not speaking the language of City Hall. Whose responsibility do you think it is to streamline some of these regulations so that everyone who lives in the state of California is fairly represented?
We have a contradiction between federal and state law. That's the problem that's not only occurring in California, but in a dozen other states around the country.
Now, you deal with that successfully here.
To some degree. I mean, we started the Los Angeles Cannabis Resource Center here in West Hollywood. It was the first center in Southern California. We had over 800 patients. They had formed a collective. They were harvesting, growing, cultivating their own marijuana. We made sure that only patients got it. We had doctor's notes checks quarterly. We worked with the district attorney's office. We worked with the LA County Sheriff's Department. We had everybody's blessing. And then about 7 years after we formed the club, the federal government raided it, shut it down, and closed its doors. So whereas we had one well-regulated and complete compliance with Prop 215 facility, when the federal government in 2001 shut that facility down, the demand was still there for marijuana. The supply was still there of marijuana.
It's a great tracking system.
So rather than having something that was well-regulated, we ended up with half a dozen unregulated facilities. And so as a result of the DEA coming in and shutting down one great success story, they created a half a dozen non-compliant facilities that then we had to get back in and regulate.
Which probably cost you money to go back in and regulate.
We lost money. The city helped put up the money for the second trustee to buy the building for the LA Cannabis Resource Center. So we lost. That property was seized from it's the only time in the history of the United States that the federal government has seized an asset from a local government, citing the drug forfeiture law as the remedy. So it's the only time the federal government reached in and took something away from a local government in over 200 years of constitutional history, because they so disagreed with it. And when you think about it, it's crazy. Marijuana is as common across this country as alcohol use, and this reefer madness coming out of the 1920s and 30s continues to sustain itself to modern day. And what needs to change is that the federal government has to take marijuana off of Schedule 1, meaning it has absolutely no medicinal use, and put it on Schedule 2.
What is happening with that? 20, 40 years are going by.
Congress won't touch it. We have a Republican-controlled House. We have a Senate that's not willing to do it. We have had Presidents Clinton, Bush, and Obama who won't do it. Everybody is so concerned about appearing soft on the war on drugs that nobody is going to do it. So what ends up happening, this continuing conflict between federal and state law, produces these clubs that are then unregulated, where people who don't need medical marijuana are able to get it, where we had a lot of backroom dealing going on, a lot of dark, shadowy figures present now in the industry, because it has been forced back into the underground because of the federal raids. When we had it out in the open air and light and we could well regulate it, we could keep the criminal element out of medical marijuana.
Correct.
Federal government came in, stomped their foot, pushed everything back into the shadows. Now this is what we have. So once again, we're required to balance what is the lesser of two evils, just like we did on needle exchange, Is it better that we allow some people who don't need medical marijuana to get it in exchange for allowing those who really need it, glaucoma, cancer, and AIDS patients, to have safe access? Well, yeah, we've made that bargain with the devil. We understand that not everybody in our medical marijuana facilities is a qualified patient. We understand that. But the greater good is served because those who do need it have safe access to it.
Mayor, I've heard you say that the three things that bring people together are war, famine, and plague. Let's talk about that if we could. In June 1969, the Stonewall riots in New York marked the beginning of what was known as the gay rights movement. Since then, what is now known as the LGBT movement, we now hold such positions as council member, mayor, supervisor, senator, assembly member, members of Congress. How have we historically worked together to accomplish equality?
The quote that you're referencing is a quote about human circumstance, and I don't know who to attribute it to, only that I've read it and I've repeated it many times, and that is that there are three circumstances under the human condition which change everything, for good and for bad, and that is war, famine, and plague. That anytime you have any of those circumstances present in a civilized society, everything changes, sometimes in very positive ways, as people come together, sometimes in very negative ways, as fascism is one of the results of war. So looking at plague and what happened here, when HIV hit our community in the early 80s, and I speak just as somebody who was living and working and playing here in West Hollywood, our gay male community and our lesbian community were never together. I mean, every now and then there were people that would work together. But for the reality, a lot of the gay men were in the discos, dancing shirtless, partying.
Women weren't allowed in the bars.
We didn't allow lesbians in our bars. A lot of the lesbian women, they were having their sing-ins, their music festivals. They were working on the Equal Rights Amendment. I mean, they had a different set of work, but we really didn't cross much into one another. Not to mention no presence of trans or bi or intersexed or queer questioning, right? We had really two separate worlds. Well, this plague came into our midst. And suddenly we sort of huddled like a herd of animals around the weak and the vulnerable in the center. And we were forced to work together, and a lot of it was very painful. I remember some of the first meetings we had here in Los Angeles. The first meeting we had, we argued with the lesbians for about 45 minutes about how to set up the chairs.
Well, we have some people in the LGBT community think that we have become complacent and fragmented. Do you agree?
In part. People always say that the LGBTQ, Q squared, I've added W, by the way.
What's
so
W?
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer questioning, intersex, and W
whatever.
For whatever. Just throw in whatever, because we're never going to have enough letters for the acronym.
Right.
But people have said that we're like one big melting pot. Well, I don't agree. I don't think we've ever been a melting pot. We're more of a chopped salad. You know what makes a really great chopped salad? You have a little radish, you have a little lettuce, you have a little tomato, you have a little carrot, you have a little celery. Each of these parts has a distinct taste, a distinct flavor, a distinct texture. At the end of the day, you have a great salad.
That's true.
But you have individual components. So is it very easy to then take the salad and separate it back out? I think that's kind of what we're seeing. And the reason is the urgency's past. Right? A lot of the urgency that existed in the early and mid-'80s where our friends had Kaposi's sarcoma, pneumocystis, toxoplasmosis, some horrible disfiguring diseases. We were all going to hospitals, morgues, funerals on a weekly basis. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was a dark terror in our midst. It was a monster, and we didn't have the luxury to think about our differences. Mm-hmm. We didn't have the luxury of difference or looking at people differently. You showed up, you were there to volunteer and help, great, come on in, right? Now the urgency's past. People are sort of going back into their lives. A lot of us that survived that horrible period of time are getting older thinking, oh my gosh, now what about retirement? I wasn't supposed to live this long. I have no golden egg. I got to think about what I'm going to do as I approach seniorhood. A lot of the issues that probably should have been dealt with 20, 30 years ago, they got deferred. Because we didn't have to think about aging as a community. We were only dealing with death and dying. Now all of a sudden we have people living longer and hopefully, ordinary lives with HIV. We have to start thinking about what happens as a community that was born out of Stonewall now grays. Instead of, the gaying of West Hollywood, I talk about the graying of West Hollywood. West Hollywood is graying, and how do we deal with that? It's a novel challenge for a lot of us. And so that's part of the challenge, is to sort of remind the young people, this didn't just happen.
How do you do that?
I think what we started to do here in West Hollywood is to do more education. You'd be surprised, a lot of young people they really don't know much about our history other than what they've seen on television or in movies. And so maybe they've seen Milk, maybe they've seen Will and Grace or Ellen DeGeneres, but they don't understand the incredible struggle that came out as we were, you know, in the early days, at least for myself, rocks and bottles and eggs thrown at us.
What we put ourselves...
anti-gay slurs. And the courage it took to just be out.
Correct.
Especially at high school or college. It took an act of courage to step out.
Correct.
And just to sort of tell them those stories. And of course, like, you know, all young people with elders will say, oh, yeah, you trudge through the snow. Whatever. It's seeds planted. They'll remember it. They'll think about it. So I think that's part of the discussion that needs to happen, is sort of educating the youngers about the sacrifices that were made. And for a lot of the elders, and I'm somewhere in between, I'm neither elder or youngster, I'm in between, we have to realize that a lot of the things we assumed about gay life that were true in the 70s and 80s do not hold true any longer.
Okay, let's have a little fun, okay? While we end our interview. I'm going to name off some names of individuals, and please tell me the first word that comes to mind for you. Elizabeth Taylor.
Saint.
Anthony Fauci.
Bureaucrat.
Sharon Stone.
Champion.
Connie Norman.
Her name's right up here. Revolutionary.
John Duran.
I don't even know. John Duran Inc. You know, that's what I playfully call it, because there's the very private and personal John Duran, which is, you know, something that I hold very close to the chest and only a handful of very intimate friends know. And then there's sort of Inc., which is the whole civil rights attorney, mayor, political leader, somebody who's been doing this for 30 years. And I mean, the Inc. sometimes takes over.
The brand.
Yeah, takes over everything else. But I mean, at the end of the day, at the end of it all, I'm still that 19-year-old gay kid dancing on the bass speaker at the disco. Anthony, I'm going to present you with this flag that flew over Santa Monica Boulevard, but I want to tell you why it's important. Because people from all over this country come to West Hollywood, they come to Santa Monica Boulevard, and people from small towns, they stop and they take their cameras and they photograph these flags, because they cannot believe there's a place in the country, in the world, where these flags fly 365 days a year. And so I'd like to present you with this flag. And thank you for coming up to West Hollywood.
Thank you, Mayor Duran.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm humbled.
Thank you.
Thank you.